Is mission as ní Cronin agus is an or more dom a bheith ann in Juv, we're delighted to have everybody here again after your lunch, and the sun has come out, so the gods are smiling down at us today, which is great. We are going to move sideways a little bit for this session. We have the pleasure of 4 artists who have worked and have known Tim and Mairead over the years and have worked with them through their different practices in different contexts, in different countries, in different art forms, and indeed in different languages, whether they're musical, linguistic, architectural, and or literary as well. So without further ado, we're going to start our conversation today, and we've had this in mind as part of our iteration of the event today as a way of honouring the Roundstone conversations that were mentioned already earlier this morning, and to kind of reconvene that ambience and that feeling. So we've decided we're going to sit for this session, and we're going to kind of continue that conversation, the co-rá agus an co-luadar le chéile a ríist. So dús beag an tuasal Nicolas Fève a going, agus beag sé a caint cuasaí grafíochta agus a cuid Oberhéin agus an nasca bhí ann idir Nicolas en français et Tim aussi. So merci à vous pour ça. Merci. So Nicolas Fève first discovered photography in a darkroom in France when he was 9. Years later, given a camera, he began to take his own pictures. His photographic practice, partly shaped by his studies in French and Swedish literature, mainly focuses on the relationship between text, language, and photography. He first encountered Tim Robinson's work following his move to Ireland in 1998, and the photographs included in Connemara and Elsewhere, the book that was mentioned this morning, that was co-produced with the Royal Irish Academy and that Jane Conroy and John Elder were also involved with, were taken over 15 years, aimed to explore the parallels between cartography and photography, the relationship between Tim Robinson's text and the photographic images, the photograph as page and photography as rhetoric. So, merci à vous, Nicolas.
Merci. Okay, so, well, thank you for the invitation, Nessa. Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Frank. So I'll start. So the title for this little talk is Tim Robinson in Our Constellation. And my title is based on Orion the Hunter. So an essay or short story written by Tim in Tales and Imaginings. So when I read the essay or the short story, it reminded me of one of Mallarmé's poem. So I quote, "Nothing will have taken place but the place, except perhaps a constellation." So today what I want to do 2 things. So firstly, I want to look at the notion of space as a constellation, hence as a kind of dot-to-dot exercise or activity. Secondly, I want to look at the notion of place through the landscape, which is the main subject of today. So the landscape as an imagined passage. So what is that space? The answer is, and I quote Tim's words as he speaks to Orion, "Your splendid outline is a trick of perspective. Viewed from the pole star, for instance, you do not exist. Constellation is the name of an act, the quintessentially human act of joining up the dots, leaping over the dark. Before we came, stars unnamed bloomed and seeded and blew away like dandelion fluff." So Tim's work, it seems to me, are shaped around the idea of constellation. His maps are a constellation of places and their features, of place names leaping over the blank of the map. His books are a constellation of different texts bound together. Most of the contents of his writing is a collective act. The substance of the Iran and Connemara books are materials collected during his different encounters or walks with people when mapping. along with quotations, pieces of information, and ideas collected through his eclectic readings, finally compiled together in the shape of a volume, or I should say an atlas, so a collection of maps. So dot to dot is what we do, according to Tim, but how do we do it? So there is two prerequisites, it seems to me. Firstly, you can only see the image of Orion in the sky, or any constellation, if you consider the sky as a plane surface. Otherwise, it's not possible. So Tim often uses the verbs surface or emerge in his language. For example, he talks in Setting Foot about a cluster of images that surface everywhere in my writing. In Pilgrimage, he writes, the artist finds a weak and intermittent music that reaches the surface dweller above. To sum up, a sheet, a page, a screen, these are flat, plane surfaces on which the constellation of a music score, a verse, a sentence, a text appears. So the second prerequisite is that you have to draw lines from one point to another one when you do dot to dot. You've done that as children, maybe? Okay. So this is what you have to do. So of course, it's nice and easy if the dots are numbered. But without number, how do you do it? And first of all, where do you start? So when in Tim's case, as he tells us in Parallax, another essay in his last book, it started with a curious habit he has inherited from his father, who he says was bringing into alignment 2 points at different distances from the eye. So the starting point is your own eye. In other words, the starting point is the gaze of a moving first-person subject. So where do you stand is number 0. So then the question is, well, what about the other points? 1, 2, 3, etc. So for Tim, these points can be found, these points could be anything. And he gives a few examples, I quote, the exact center of a mirror, a fly on the wall, a far-off chimney top, the first star of the evening, etc. Points of light and dark or darkness compose themselves into nameable patterns, diagrams, theorems, pictures. So at the end of the day, or I should say at the end of the dot to dot, a picture emerges projected on a surface. So the problem now is how do we pass from space to page? So that was one of the questions for Tim. So how do you pass from space to page or onto any kind of flat surface covered with traces? So in that case, the landscape gives us a method. The landscape gives a way to pass from space to page. So I'll try to see how. So there are 3 aspects encapsulated by the term landscape. Firstly, it's a site, okay, with its physical features. Secondly, it's a point of view on this site. And thirdly, it's a representation of that site. So a landscape could be any of these. That means that the very same word refers to 3 different dimensions. An objective one, the site, a subjective one, the point of view, the gaze, the experience, and the last one, it's a poetic one. It's a form of expression. For example, the painting, the photograph, the description of that site. And these 3 dimensions allow or give way to a passage between reality and its representation. And the process, this process hinges on a very important point, which has affinities with lyrical poetry, which is the first-person subject of enunciation. So I, when I speak, I. This is why all Tim's writings are narrated by an I. which implies a subjective point of view and a particular experience. So what happens then is a kind of contemplation, which proceeds then through the unfolding and showing forth of images. This happens everywhere in teams work. So from the act of alignment of selected points, it pulls strings, intertwines threads, dance them, and images emerges, surfaces at the end. So anything in the landscape can be a pretext for the text to come. For example, my first quotation, at the end of it, so he's putting strings about stars, Orions, myth, etc. And at the end of it, there is an image that comes up, which is the dandelion fluff. Like the stars, like the galaxy, the stars, you know, expanding from the Big Bang. So, and the resulting image, so, is both a trope, a figure of speech, so the way you express things you see, and a peculiar representation laid out in front of the reader or spectator. So the image is then the passage between the land itself, the poetic self, and yourself as a reader or spectator. So in order to convey these images and his own experience from landscape to reader, Tim decided to create maps and to trace lines made up of words. The main idea is to relate. So to relate in 4 different ways. A, to relate in the sense of to narrate, to tell, to recount a journey, the journey of relating, the journey of relations. B, to relate, to link crucial points in the landscape. C, to relate, to connect together the landscape, his own experience, and the reader through images. And finally, D, to relate the reader to his writing through a blank, blind eye. And he does so, he does this relating through prose, because it is the non-metric form of language, and because his matter is prosaic. But it is obviously a lyrical prose, and I'm finishing soon there. So, so relating the landscape gives you authority. It gives you a voice. To be, you would be in the position of an authorized reader and of an author. So this is the feelings I have when I read Tim's text. I'm like an author in a way. The most basic and common expression of this might just be the wow under a starry night, that expression. And Tim's approach, just to sum up Tim's approach, it would be start from your own experience, find out crucial points and link them, consider the images that come up, and on reflection, experiment on reality to see what happens. And this last book is a good example of that. So I would like to conclude by saying that Tim's works have become a reality we can experiment on or with. Tim's work gives us a space for our voice to resonate through that blank, blind eye. He lays out gaps and passages for us to move and to be moved. All the blanks of the maps, this idea of constellations. And displacing yourself enables you to see and to reflect. So it could be the slightest movement of a hand, like in dance or music, to move your eyes along a line, along a text, an image, a sculpture, a building, to move your vocal cords, displacing some air that in return touches an ear, like singing. So art allows you to do that wherever, whenever, anywhere, out of nowhere. So when experimenting on reality, to echo his title, Experiments on Reality, the only method or device we have to measure life matter is art. Thank you.
Do you want to show some of the images?
Yeah, there's three images. I don't know, what's the time, Nessa?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah,
That's okay?
Yeah.
I don't know, just to comment very quickly, for example, this photograph is very flat. So you can do an experiment, for example, now. That would be interesting. I would like to know, when you see that, where is your eye, your gaze landing, first of all? And if it's landing anywhere, does it stay there or does it move? So you see there is very flat. The background is very gray and very blurred. So there is no strong perspective because Teams doesn't have one perspective on things, as you know. And so I was playing with the idea of line as team collecting information, pieces of walls along the way, and then string them together. And I was trying to play with the idea of reading as well. So how do you read that? Because on the left, the image is a bit blurred, but on the right, it's quite sharp. So normally your eyes go on the fluffy bit, maybe. Does it? I don't know. And because in our culture, Teams culture, we read and write from top left to bottom right. This is the line of the barbed wire. But at the same time, obviously, what Tim did is he went for walks, and then he comes back, and this is his work is always retrospective. In photography, it's like this too. So then, in order, you see, if you look at the wind, and if you look at the blur, the sharp blur bit, so you go down, well, this is my experience of it. You go down, and then you have to go up, back up, in order to twist everything together, to intertwine everything together. So this is how my work could relate in a way to Tim's approach of landscape through that idea of alignment, finding crucial points in the landscape, knowing where you stand, obviously, that's very important, like in a map. So the blank eye of Teams puts up all this text, it's like we're on a map. So first of all, you have to know where you stand in order to see what's in front of you, in order then to make a move. The next one is this one, sorry. So this one was quite recent. So if I get up, can I get up? If I have to explain this, so I would say that's the gates where you come in order to go to the Team Studio. That's Team Studio. You've got the sea beyond the windows. Because I'm in front of the window pane of the front door, there is reflection of the back, the building at the back there. So you see, this is layered, but this is only one surface. And when you explain it like this, there is things in front of you, there is things behind you, but it's all on the same surface. And when you do that, on that image, for example, you're mapping your image in a way. And the self, so here I was in front of the window, and you see, you cannot see the photographer. And the photographer blur is just the shadow of the photographer. Like the eye, when Tim's write, it's just the shadow. Fidelma, you were saying he was very quiet, wouldn't say anything. It was like the shadow of himself if you were beside him in a way. So the ego has to go away. The ego has to be shadowed. It's not like in Narcissus. Narcissus, he sees reflection for his love, he drowns. So in a way, with Tim, there's nothing narcissistic about it. You see? And he says in the quotation, I cut the quotation, but he says at some point, he's talking about the darkened solipsism. So maybe it was because he was a bit depressed at the time, at some point on our end, etc. But first of all, is that the ego has to be darkened. It has to be just a shadow. And if you only the shadow, you can see through. If there were not the shadow here, you would see my face, and you wouldn't see inside. You wouldn't see the other layers, the sea, the studio, etc. So this is one aspect, one other aspect of Teams, and yeah, back maybe, is that? Yeah, and I don't know. We can see clearly, but This is the idea of surface. It was for another bit, but I cut it. So it's just the idea of surface, the idea of the compass rose, of living at the edge. Because if you block the image like this, you have some kind of a 3D image with the surface, and then you see the stem going at the bottom. But once you do that, you see that it's the same surface. So there is difficulty to link the two visually. So you can be helped with the stems going underneath in the deep of the water. And in a way, so it creates some kind of a constellations as well. Because what's I think interesting in the idea of constellation is that you have to see it as a surface in the sky when you watch it at the sky. But obviously, if you look at it at the point of an astronomer, obviously there is great deepness.
The green is to go forward. Yeah. Okay, merci Nicolas. We'll now move to Siobhán McDonald. And Siobhán's practice draws attention to contemporary topics dealing with air, breath and atmospheric phenomenon, weaving scientific knowledge in our art in a poetic and thoughtful manner. In a practice that emphasises fieldwork and in collaboration, she works with natural materials, withdrawing them from their cycles of generation, growth and decay. This process gives form to a range of projects which consider our place in Earth in the context of deep geological time. Her work with glaciers and other natural phenomena deploy a unique artistic language that give form to intangible and richly varied processes, including painting, drawing, film and sound. And we're delighted to have Siobhán here with us. She's been a very busy lady in recent years. Her friendship with Tim and Mairead goes back to maybe 2010 or even earlier before then, wasn't it?
About 2010.
Yeah, when Tim wrote an essay for one of Siobhán's exhibitions. So we're delighted to have Siobhán here with us today. So I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. Oh, it's up. I was driving to Connemara yesterday, and I haven't been here in years, and I just felt so happy, you know, and I hit over the hills, and I could almost feel Tim and Mairead coming out to welcome everybody, and it just felt so good to be back. So, yeah, I went to Roundstone Talks Sheila was there, and Moya, and yeah, a couple of us are here. They were just wonderful. It was a lovely way to meet with random people in a very organic nature and just have the chat, you know, about anything. So anyway, I'm going to talk about 4 pieces of work today and just little bits about how Tim influenced me. So this artwork is called Seism. And I made it back in 2010, and it's made on smoked paper, which I smoked and then lacquered. And I used a stylus, which is kind of like a tiny prism, and scratched it over the smoke. And I did it in a place called the Museum of Mühlwürcher in Germany, where they still record volcanoes by hand. And they allowed me to make this piece, and I made it in response to the tipping point of climate that we're going into now, because we're going from, we've gone, you know, from the last epoch into the Anthropocene, and that kind of moment, that tipping point, was something I wanted to allude to, and I wanted to use an ancient practice of recording before computerization, because in my work I like to look at old apparatuses and processes where people used natural materials and simple ways, using intuition and the kind of knowledge inside the earth in order to record it. So before we got into all this kind of, you know, technology. So anyway, this piece came out of that. Tim gave me the name Seism, and I used it. And Seism means to record, you know, to make reference to the rhythm. And so I'm showing you this today because I want to talk about the Jesuits in Ireland in the 1920s. Actually invented a process that nobody else had in Ireland or in the world before, and it was how to record volcanoes and earthquakes using a very rudimentary process of literally sticking wires into the ground and having the antennae hit these energy points, attaching it to a roll of smoke paper, and again, this idea of when the Earth moved or when there was a signal or a rhythm, that the prism would scratch itself. And they were doing it in Ireland. And so if a volcano or, you know, there was one of them actually was an earthquake in Alaska in the 1940s, was felt in Ireland at the very same moment, you know, without a computer. And it was in Rathfarnham Castle that they had this apparatus set up. And there's lovely stories of the Jesuits coming out in their pajamas in the middle of the night because they'd feel the, you know, the rhythm, and they go and they make these notations, and there was wonderful mathematical records of every single thing that happened. So I drove to Connemara in 2010, one November evening, and I met Tim and Mairead for the first time, and I brought some of these original drawings with me, and that was the beginning of our conversation. And so I didn't really know Tim's work that well. I just had read some things, and they opened me so with such welcome and such intrigue. And it was just extraordinary because it opened up so many portals in my mind, and it was just kind of their energy as well. You know, they were so nice and so interesting, you know. And so Tim talked to me about the fact that he only ever really at that point had thought about things that happen above the line. And I was explaining to him that in my work I'm interested in the fine layer between the soil and the rocks, where some of the most important changes in our contemporary times are taking place, you know? So it's that energy system called a critical zone scientifically, where all systems are connected. And if those systems all have to be working together in order for the planet to operate, and ecosystems to be able to cope. So you were talking earlier about this, him feeling that he was the prism with which walked across the land. So he felt that this practice was very much like the way the Jesuits had recorded that he was the prism walking across the land when he was making his maps. So, so this is a photograph that I took in Greenland a couple of months ago, and I was on a ship, I was on an expedition, and I started thinking very much about deep time in a different sort of a way, because I know I read a lot about it and I'm very interested in it, but I was really experiencing it here because I was standing at the very top of the ship. We were in the Davis Strait, this really important part of Greenland where they think it's the biodiversity is actually thriving, which is really good news. But they didn't know that. So there's these oceanographers I was with, and we were listening to the sound of the whale song and how it has changed due to pollution, etc. However, I was looking out the window, and these icebergs were just floating by, and within like maybe 2-3 minutes, you know, one would float by, and I'd feel like, well, there goes 20,000 years just like that, you know. And I was trying to take it all in, and it was very difficult because, anyway, this brought me to one of the last conversations I had with Tim in England before he got sick, just before he got sick. And we were talking about our mutual interest in glaciology, you know, ice and different states from frozen to non-frozen, and petrification and all sorts of things. And we talked about his text, The Blood of the Glacier. And, you know, and it just, there was so many mutual interests, but he was, his writing is just so extraordinary. I have to almost lie down after I read one line, you know. It takes me ages to even take it in. But so anyway, we talked a lot about this idea of being in, you know, beside a glacier and the enormity of it and the majesty of it, and the fact that if you're standing close to it with your body, that you almost feel sort of time in a different sort of way, and that you don't necessarily just hear it with your ears, you hear it with your whole body, because you are actually standing beside archives of history, water that's been around since primordial times, that hold the records of everything. So as they melt, as they freeze, then they become an archive, and it's another form of archive that we spoke about. And then the tiny bubbles, that those bubbles hold the atmosphere back to different times, but the sound waves inside of that and the dust and the matter going back to the beginning of time, if it's held inside a bubble and then the bubble bursts as the glacier melts, it's emitting those sound waves back into our present time. It's emitting that energy back in. And as we're going through this almost way too fast melting point, that archives of history are literally melting. This is a piece of work I'm working on at the moment, but the energy of that is coming back to us way too quickly. So this is a piece of work I did a couple of years ago. It's called Solar Skin, and it's a series of paintings on the floor there, and they are made with a very unique material made from charred bone and carbon. I was collaborating with the European Space Agency at the time, and they were sending Solar Orbiter to a part of the sun we've never been to before, and they needed to create a surface so heat resistant. And anyway, these Irish scientists allowed me to work with them, and they invented this material. And it's gas because it's actually natural, and it can take the heat of the sun. So this artwork is about the calving that I experienced in the Arctic at another time, and all these pieces of ice separating and pulling apart. And I baked these paintings. They're on sea sponge in very high temperatures, so they cracked. And so it reminded me a lot of Tim's maps again, and his influence of talking to me about these, the cartographies of how he created the maps. And then I look at the cracks in these, and it's like a crack cartography of a melting landscape as opposed to one that's, solid. Anyway, I have no idea what time it is. I'm going on. I'm nearly finished. This is some of my current work at the moment. I have a show in a couple of weeks' time in the Model in Sligo, and it's called The Bogs Are Breathing. And this is one piece from a series called Cosmic Gas. And the series are all made from the gases inside the bogs, because I'm very interested in the invisible nature of the materials and the plants that actually create our air. So as the plants over time sit in the bogs, they become gaseous. And some of those gases are quite toxic, and some of them are okay. But funnily enough, when the glaciers will be gone, they contain the bogs underneath, and inside that are some very dangerous viruses, etc. So anyway, I created these images using plants that I collected on the bog sites, and I used methane in order to create the ink to make these images, to push them through. So this is a drawing that I made from the methane ink as well. It's one of the series. I can't see it properly from here, but I was making the connection in the series between the idea of the circumference of the retina of an eye to the circumference of a mushroom to a solar eclipse. And each piece shows that journey. And it very much made me think, when I was preparing this talk about Tim, his talking about going to the edges to come back to the center. That idea of, the connection of all things, and from the micro to the macro, and that, there's a line that goes right through everything. So I could talk on, I have no idea what time it is, so I'm going to shut up now. But I was going to leave you with a quote by Tim, it's helped me in this exhibition. And he says, mind is being reabsorbed. He's speaking about a bog. Mind is being reabsorbed into matter. Humanity's imposition of language, order, meaning is being sucked down and choked off by nature. And I was thinking that maybe in this mysterious timelessness that places the bogs, that reminds us that we're not only mortal, that we're actually made of the same stuff.
Well, thank you.
And I think your exhibition is opening on the 29th of April?
29th, and
in Sligo.
Sligo, please come. Yeah,
April.
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody's welcome. I think it's about 4 o'clock in the day.
Very good.
Be there. It's great.
Okay, we're now moving down to West Cork with Susan Stenger, and when we were talking about assembling a group today, Susan was somebody that we really wanted to have as part of the discussion. A lot of the times when we think about Tim's work, we think of text and image, but then there's also this thing called the soundscape. So we're delighted to have Susan here with us today to talk about the language of sound and the interconnections that are there as well. So Susan Stenger is a performer and sound artist whose practice transcends boundaries, an accomplished flautist and specialist in performing the music of John Cage and Phil Niblock. She was also founder of Wall of Guitars group Band of Susans and an all-bass art band Big Bottom, that's really hard to say, and has collaborated with an eclectic range of artists, including Nick Cave, amongst others. Her layered soundtracks and installations embrace forms, patterns and systems from both the natural world and human constructs. She's composed soundtracks for Laura Gannon's Silver House, Jesse Jones's Tremble Tremble, and Alvin Ivorian's An Experiment with Time. But many of you may already be familiar with her work, whether consciously or unconsciously, as her music was featured in Pat Collins's 2011 film Tim Robinson Connemara, about the renowned writer and photographer. So Susan, you're very welcome today.
Thank you. Could I grab that?
Yeah.
Am I in your way? No, no, no.
You're okay.
Thanks, Nessa. Great to be here. It's, I can feel Tim and Mairead's spirit just in the love of everyone who's talked about them. I miss them. Choked up already. Oops, and I just hit my mic. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how I approach making the sound for the Tim Robinson film, Pat Collins's film, but as a bit of context to describe very briefly how I kind of made the transition from being a performer to a composer. And when I was much younger, probably nearly 50 years now ago, when I was a teenager, I got very interested in the music of John Cage, and at that point decided I wanted to be a serious performer. And we were talking about constellations just a few minutes ago, but for instance, one of the things I was given to perform a John Cage score is a star map. I perform a star map. One time it was a map of Walden Pond, because the piece was about Thoreau, and I had to perform that. And of course, his famous so-called silent piece, 4 minutes, 33 seconds. Cage was all about, he said, art should imitate nature in its manner of operation, in her manner of operation. And so I guess I was grounded very early in the idea that as an artist, your job is not to express yourself. And I know a lot of people would disagree with me, but that's what I got from Cage, and that's what I really responded to. What you do is you choose your materials, you find your structure or sonic architecture, to use the word of the day, and you find a way to unleash that, to set something in motion and create what results is the kind of natural result of the process you set in motion or the materials that you chose. And that is the poetry, not you imposing yourself or your ego and trying to express, I think I'll write a melancholy tune. And when I started making my own work, I started exploring what forms resonated with me. And some of those were song forms. I was very interested in folk music, and then I was playing in a rock band, and quite interested in the kind of archetypal structures of pop songs as well as kind of an abstract thing. And this is a score of a day, or a segment of a day, of this 96-day-long sound installation that I made for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Lyon. And I'm showing it just because it addresses these real fundamentals, because the vertical is, there's a separate kind of content on each track that are stacked. And then from left to right is time. And then, of course, the solid line is when something's happening, and the space is when something isn't. And it, to me, it's like a landscape, but it's something that I drew. I made my own landscape with those kind of very, very fundamental ideas of moving in time, sound starting, sound stopping, intentional sound, and unintentional sound is what Cage would call silence. And the more I looked at that, the more it looked to me like Morse code, or sometimes it looked like a I Ching hexagram. And I started thinking, oh, there's all kinds of cosmic relationships here. And when I first started reading Tim's work, he actually addressed this very idea, and he talked about the foundations of form, and we were talking about this earlier, but in My Time and Space, he said, the earth was without form and void, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God divided the light from the darkness. That the basis of existence is difference. The first step in understanding is discrimination. This whole idea that the very, very foundation of form is something versus nothing. Dark, light, and for me, sound and silence, I have to say, in inverted quotes. And so somehow I thought, eureka, using Morse code, and because I was writing music to go with the film and thinking about Connemara and Marconi's experiments, I thought this is a way in to make something rhythmic, but not regular. And so I translated certain words into Morse code, one of them being Connemara, and the other one being Awan for river. And I translated those into this kind of dot and dash structure, and then made those parts on the computer. And then I layered them and made a kind of landscape out of them. But of course, instead of them all starting at the same time, I staggered all the entrances. So I made a kind of polyphony, but all that, this kind of quite complex sounding thing, which I never would have been able to make if I was intentionally trying to make all the parts connect in a certain way. All comes from just the word Connemara being spelt out in Morse code. And because I used a kind of plaintive sounding instrument, the English horn, it sounds incredibly melancholy, but of course it's just the word Connemara. And I also was quite keen on Tim's ideas about the Connemara fractal, the idea of forms, and you were kind of getting into it with your balls of fluff and galaxies. You know, these kinds of forms that repeat no matter how zoomed in or zoomed out you are. And this is a still from Pat's film, a close-up of bark. But of course, it just looks like one of Tim's maps. And it's these very basic forms. And Tim talked about, you know, this whole idea of making the mark, the dark and the light on his maps, on his pen making a mark and choosing not to make a mark, and how that all worked. There's something, I mean, so fundamental there, and yet these kinds of curves and contours also appear in massively zoomed out way. And something like that, I just want to play that. In fact, I did. I just played that on the flute. So there was something as basic as that. And then ways to take more abstract forms and take something that might have been a tiny little detail of an ornament in a Channos tune, but slow it down and make a big arc out of it. So it's all the materials for me need to resonate and to come from a kind of significant source, and then I can go deeper in or further out and layer them in all sorts of different ways. And back about 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to get a fellowship to do some research at the Appalachian Sound Archive in Kentucky, and which was fabulous. And I also, strangely enough, discovered that my favorite musician from Kentucky, Roscoe Holcomb, who I was studying, was born on the exact same day as John Cage, September 5th, 1912. And somehow this was like, blew my mind. But on a day off, I went to a bourbon distillery, as you do in Kentucky. And I had this major, like, also mind-blowing breakthrough, because I was going on this tour, and it was very nice, and it smelled really good, and I knew I would get a drink at the end. And we went into this big room, and on all these plinths were these glass jars, and the guide explained, these are the ingredients. These are the materials to make bourbon. They looked very beautiful and displayed this way. And he said, and there's a recipe. Long time handed down, and so on. He said, but then there are the wild notes. And I just thought, yeah, that's all this music, this fiddle music I've been listening to that has, there are the notes and then the rhythms, but then there are all these kind of like slightly out of tune bits, but little bends and little delays in the rhythm that are very, very personal, and that, the same tune might get played 10 miles away by somebody else who has their own little idiosyncrasy. So the wild notes, I realized, was, yes, that's the third and the kind of magic ingredient, and that is, again, nature in its manner of operation, and also a way of introducing chance, which goes back to Cage, and something that Tim found great beauty in, and also a way, again, to take the act of composition or creation away from my own ego, and to allow certain elements in the creation to be allowed to happen by chance. So the way I might layer things, I don't exactly know how it's going to fall into place or how it's going to sound in the end, but I accept it as part of the process. And one thing that I did do when I was moving on from working with Tim, and I had wanted to do when I was studying the Connemara maps, was find something that was a cross-section diagram of Connemara, because to me that was like a perfect correlation to what I was interested in, which were long drones and layers, and somehow that I thought could be a perfect score. And we've been talking about deep time. Well, the way that I like to work with layers is I make very slow-moving structures, kind of in the deep lower layers, and I do think of it as kind of a geological, deeper, and then as the layers get closer to the top, they're more closer to your consciousness, and they might be like little bits of melody or things that are more recognizable. And so I went on to do a project in Northumberland, and this is one. This is the first page of a diagram that I found through an archivist in the Natural History Museum in Newcastle. But what it is a geological diagram of the entire coast of Northumberland, from the River Tyne to the Scottish border. And it was made by a mining engineer in the 1830s. And he drew all the subterranean layers and then the features of the terrain, and even little historical and cultural features that he drew on the top. And he put in all the types of rock. Those are coal seams. But the entire diagram was about 40 feet long, about yay high. And it had just been sitting in this archive for years and years. And she brought it out in tissue paper and unrolled it and said, "Were you thinking of something like this?" And yes. So I was able to exhibit that. And I made instead of constructing my own kind of sonic architecture, then I kind of accepted this as my template and used this. And the materials then all related to Northumbrian folk music, Northumbrian history, and also the very actual geology as it moved from the Tyne to the Scottish border, and the intrusive features, as you can see. I mean, all that I reflected abstractly, but it's reflected in a 1-hour sound piece that kind of moves. And so then I call it sonic geology. That's kind of where I'm at right now. Whether or not I'm actually relating it to the geology of a place, the music I'm making feels like a kind of sonic geology in any case. So.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Yep. That was great. Thank you. Our final speaker on the panel this afternoon is Martina Durac. Martina is a filmmaker, curator and lecturer for over 20 years with interest in art, nature, literature, music and community and how people organise themselves. She's explored this in her many diverse projects, whether through observation of the lives of our coastal communities and wild landscapes, artistic impulse of writers, musicians and painters, or musical gatherings. She's a board member of the Screen Directors Guild of Ireland, where she advocates on behalf of Documentary Alliance, and is also an active member of the Women in Film and Television Ireland, and she's currently the artistic director of the Ennis Book Club Festival. So Martina, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll say it. Is that it? Cool. All right. Hi everyone. Gur míle mágad. Tás an dan ar bhean seo aniu agus gur míle mágad Frank as up an cura huirtam con Laird Free Sale agus Éir agus Irecht Tim Robinson. It's great to be here, to be able to talk, to be in the company, I should say, of people who are going to talk about the life and work and legacy of Tim Robinson. I feel like I'm kind of very much adjacent to the conversation we've been having all day in some ways. I met him just a few times through work, and it's many years ago. But his influence, and I was thinking about it last night because I was talking to Frank, and then I realised, oh, maybe I'm kind of overstating the case, because in my mind I thought that Tim Robinson has had a deep impact on documentary makers all over Ireland. But now I think that maybe what it is he's had a deep impact on documentary makers who, in some way in their work, are connected or exploring landscape and people. And if you're doing that, and if you have been doing that at all in your life, quite clearly, you know, you've been thinking about Tim Robinson. And so I think like I grew into my filmmaking. I went to college with Frank, that's how we know each other. We studied film together. But I think I grew into my filmmaking with Tim Robinson always sort of somewhere in the background because of reading his works and knowing the maps. And again, this is something we discussed last night, you know. To me, the maps, far more than being maps, to be honest with you, they're maps, okay. But to me, they're works of great artistry and they're works of the imagination. So that's always where I've gone with Tim Robinson's maps. I never kind of really was wondering about where I was going to get to a place, or if I was looking to get from a place to another place. It was just the sheer thrill of looking at how he had brought to bear something practical, you could say for sure, in terms of being a map, but something that was always connected to some sort of deep, almost inaccessible work of the imagination and our place upon the earth. That's how it's always struck me, that his maps are. So anyway, I found myself then many years later, having made lots of different things. I'm not a nature or natural history filmmaker at all. I never claimed to be, I never had any interest in being it. I appreciate the work that people who do that work do, but my connection with film has always been about ultimately the lives of people and connecting with people. So I started thinking about the Burren years ago. You know, when I was a kid, I'm from Limerick City, and my father was from Clare. And when we were kids, we spent our summers in Clare. We spent summers in Lisdoon and Ruska, just outside Lisdoon, and Doolan and Kilkee, and the Burren and Lahinch and Stuyman. So it's always been there as a part of my sort of ecology, my entire ecology. You know, when we were kids, I was saying this to someone a few weeks ago, we always had the best of both worlds, because if Limerick was playing Clare in the hurling, no matter what happened, we were going to win. So years later, I found myself talking to T.G. Carr about I wanted to make a project on the Burren. And they said, oh, okay, right, what do you want to do on the Burren? You know, it's not a Gaeltacht. And I'm not a fluent Irish speaker, but I speak Irish, and it's a hugely important part of my life. I said, yeah, but it's not that it's not a Gaeltacht, although some would argue that it's a Brac Gaeltacht, but it's, how would I put it? It's just an essential part of Ireland. We really must explore it. You know, we must give ourselves a chance. So I said, okay, go off and do your research. And this is leading me to something. I'm not going to give you, you know, an anecdote on everything that I did to make the Burren series, but all I want to talk about really here is the Burren series. But in relation to the fact that I always felt that Tim Robinson was somewhere in the back of my head as I was making it. And I had read his books, of course. But when you're doing something, and I think it's probably the same for all of you, while you might be influenced and open to influence from someone or thing or place, you don't want that to be constantly in your ear, of course, but it's lovely to have it as a kind of a beat in the background. So as I was preparing for this, I said to Frank, look, I'm going to kind of muse. Is that okay? Can I just muse on the Burren, Tim Robinson, and the work that I did, and how he kind of was there somewhere. But things were occurring to me, and it's so interesting today to hear the things that people have said, because they echo things that I've been thinking about. And one was that he said this thing, and this is before I made the Burren, I was thinking about it. He said, for me, making a map was to be a one-to-one encounter between a person and a terrain, a commitment in terms of time and effort, an existential project of knowing a place. I was like, thank you, you know. And I thought, can I use those words to describe what it is I'm trying to do in the Burren series? So when I spoke to the broadcaster and the funders about it, I said, look, I want to do something that is about landscape, it is about place, but it's completely interconnected to the people. And if it's not that, then there's not much point in me even trying to approach it. And it was interesting to me when I went to speak to the people in Burren Bio, that great organisation, before we, you know, got funding or anything. I was talking to a woman there, Bridget, and she literally said to me, if you're making something about the Burren and it's not about the people, you're missing everything. The Burren is its people. And I was like, great, okay, because I feel the same way, you know. And as I was thinking again about this day today, I was thinking about Tim, and I had a note here. So interesting what you said earlier, Fidelma. I had written, in exploring what drove him, I found myself wondering about presence and absence. And in relation to him and the life he lived and the work that he did. And obviously you knew him a lot more than I did. And it was so interesting when you said, you were talking about going around in Siobhán, you said it was almost as if he didn't exist. And on my notes here, I said it's physical presence or absence of ego. And that those things, it seemed to me, were fundamental to his work. And yet at the same time, in a subtle way. It was just, he didn't need to do whatever it was to manifest himself into the thing that he was creating or the life that he was creating, because he knew that you tread lightly and maybe in a way that's your responsibility, the person that he was, as both a writer and a cartographer, and as a documentary maker. In my opinion, it's the same, in that you want to tread lightly, you want to, for me anyway, because people are so interconnected to what you're doing, you want to find a way for people to feel comfortable to open themselves to you, and you know you're taking something from them. You're being given something and you're taking something from them, and they have to understand and feel that the bond that you're created is a real one. So you're not just there to swoop in and then leave. And so, am I okay for time? Oh shit, sorry, okay. That's really important, you know, so that everything that he did and the way he spoke about what he was doing and the way he spoke about being in the landscape and being with people, I felt was mirrored for the project that we were doing. You know, we spent a long time in research, we spent 14 months filming, we spent probably about 8 months in editing. And so in a way, you're kind of constructing something out of nothing. And so that's a massive responsibility, but it's also a great freedom. And Finola mentioned something about expressing landscape through language. And I think that with the documentary project, you're expressing it through the visual material and sounds and language and people's stories and their place in the landscape. And that was always, all those things were kind of echoing for me when we were making the series. But I wanted to just show you, if I can, just 2 quick pieces. And one, I suppose, is whenever I see it, it encapsulates for me that sense of people being at the heart of the burn. And this is 2 farmers, a father and son, Pat and Oliver. And it's just a small part of the time that we spent with them.
Cattle were never meant to be inside. The freedom that the pairing of both farms give us, I mean, and that was done back 4 generations ago. I mean, imagine to have a farm 4 generations ago, one at the gateway of the burn, and the other farm inside the heart of the burn. The cattle are content. You can see you don't have to be a scientist to understand that one. So it's a beautiful marriage, like, between both farms. It's great.
The top off. Like, we have the best of both worlds, you know. What we inherited from other people by listening to them and by actually seeing what they were seeing. I mean, there was an old saying my mother had, if you only looked across the wall, what you could learn from other people.
A farm will never say no. If you emptied out your pockets and to ask you for your trousers, you know, never say no. You'll keep putting your heart and your soul and all you have and you haven't into it. But sure, why shouldn't you be where you're happiest?
So they were 2 of the farmers that featured in the series, and they absolutely are where they're happiest, right? They're beautiful people. And they have 2 small farms in the burn and one on the edge of the burn. But they kind of encapsulated for me what we were doing in the project, because there's a generosity of spirit that you get from people if you spend enough time with them and if they feel like you built the bond. Because at the start, sometimes I've been meeting people, it's the same with anything that I do. And I know I'm asking them for a huge level of trust to be given to me, and I'm a comparative, or in some cases, a complete stranger to them. And I always say to people, I can only say to you that you need to trust me in what I'm doing, and that over a period of time we'll get to know each other, and then you'll work out how deep that trust can go or will go for you. And if it doesn't develop, then we'll talk again. It's the only thing you can do, because you ask a lot when you go to a people, when you go to a landscape, and you're asked to be involved and you're coming from the outside. There's a beauty to coming from the outside, I think, you know, to making a project, because you have a different point of view, of course. But at the same time, you are asking to be allowed in, and you're asking to be, I mean, with the burn, with that project, I mean, it was about, for me, trying to find a way to celebrate, to be clear-eyed at the same time as well about the challenges that you know, abound in places like the burn. There's no place like the burn, so I don't know how I said that, but anyway, in that unique place that is the burn, for people living there, but also then to spend 4 seasons in the place, which we got to do, to film over 4 seasons, so that there's a heartbeat to the project as you're making it, and you can see it change. You can see things develop. You can see things change in people's lives. You know, people who had kids and they were small and they were growing up and all of that kind of thing. But on top of that then was the burn itself, and it was a character in the series. So that's how I treated the burn as a character, and then the people are the characters who move through this landscape character. Can I just show that second piece, Brian?
We might finish up then.
The walls, and then we'll finish up. Okay, so this is the burn and its walls as a character.
Fallí tluiche I ngacháid se leagtar súl. Sníonn siad trí híorreacht na bórna ar nós ribíní. Nós go rá náitir fad fúte le chéile ag falla. Tóca mar bagáilú do chlocha neadathe gunne chéile le cáréis, gon mórteal ar bud an ramó. Híl go leachan na bátrúm mírúilte chamach a dróna síríochta har a dalamh scairdiúil seo. Seasan siad in ómós go na fermiorí ananaide a hóigiad. Cuid go na fallaí hó slacht frisin, go gurdí sihar na ord crinne sanúl. Cuid eile agus cuma caite le chéile agus trína chéile orb, ag iad fós in a seasa in ai sían na bórne. Fallaí fohine, fallaí leke, fallaí timpláilte, fallaí fedín. Bachá plocha glána ó halamh na bórne agus bé seo an slí a bhar le na dhéanam. Ach mar thora ar a seift fracticúil seo, crothíú rairc tíad a gúin a bheith an grím ar an tálaíocht. Tá lorg na nglúnta chó róin granta go deos na fallaí seo atá ngacháid beo.
So I'll literally finish up by saying that it was and it has been an immense privilege to have the writings and the work and the kind of the creative generosity of Tim Robinson always there, you know, in the background when you're making work of any kind, but of this, because it's the deep generosity, as I mean, of him exploring the human condition as well as the landscape and everything within it, how we live, you know. So I am shortly going to embark on another big project like that, and this time it is in Connemara. So it's great that I'm here today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Martina. Okay, we'll take some time for questions and observations for the panel. But first of all, actually, I'd like you maybe just if there's any observations for each other. I have just a quick question maybe for Nicola and for Susan. Both of you talked about, and your images as well were quite monochrome, and a lot of people have commented on Tim's maps were black and white. There was no colour. So I wondered, for either of you, how did that affect your own work, or why do you think that choice was made for him in a way as well?
Well, to me, it kind of goes back to that fundamental of form that I was talking about. And he talked about making the marks on the page and many, many darks. And he also talked about the idea of, as a map maker, there's a term ornamentation, but he said the ornamentation is the map. It's not superfluous extra. And when I was doing research on Joe Heaney, reading Lilith O'Leary's great book, and preparing to make some music for Pat's film about Joe, I listened to some talks that Joe Heaney had done, and he talked the same about singing Sean-Nós, about the ornamentation and how important get it right, and that it was, you know, it was the real substance of the singing. And so I think it's the mark, it's the actual choice to make that gesture.
So it serves part of the function almost as well.
Yeah, and the rest of it kind of takes care of itself. And Tim said, I forget which book, but he said he minds the territory between aesthetics and logic. And it's like, as you said, he treads lightly. He stays out of trying to impose his ego on it, but he's letting it breathe and talk. And that to me, the maps are just a kind of beautiful picture of that idea.
Great, thank you. Nicola, any observations? And for your own work in particular?
Well, just to follow on what Susan said, I think, and what Sheila, I think Sheila, you quoted, I'm the pain on the pain is. And so that's that idea as well that goes with the trace and the mark and the black and white. So the pain, and he said that his map is to recount an experience on the site. So that's why I think he used, and he explains that why he used just black and white and doesn't want color. So that's one aspect. And Suzanne said as well in these books, in this one, so because I looked at it because
you have a lot more tabs.
Because there is an essay called Constellation and question mark. Because I said, okay, constellation, everything will be explained in that. That is it. And the word constellation is only in the title. It's not about constellation at all. Well, it's all about, you know, geometry.
A hexagon inside.
Hexagon. It's about Blaise Pascal theorem. I'll spare you the details. But there is that aspect of geometry. And geometry, etymologically, the measure of Earth. And because he has that compulsive alignment process, everything has to be aligned. These 3 points he inherited from his father. So Blaise Pascal theorem, it's about how points align. From a cone. So he was doing that on the landscape everywhere. So if you have colors, it's distracting in a way. If you want to trace a line, you need points, that's all. And if you want points, you need big blanks. So I think he associated that with geometry, because he said that everything he saw in front of him was geometrical figures, except he says something else in the Little Gaelic Kingdom that he talks about the fairy tales of circle and lines, and so it's all a fairy tale. That's why he had to go back to the landscape, to the mapping, to the tracing, to the marking, in order to be rescued from that compulsive geometric search. And in relation to what I do, it's all the black and white. It allows you to play between with the gaps. This is one thing we were thinking about doing with Tim. It's something about gaps and intervals. There is a glimpse of that in the essay he wrote about Olwen Fouéré in Tales and Imaging as well. It ends on a gap. And I think this is what he wanted as well. He wanted gaps, so we can move. And the black and white allows you to do that interplay, and to show the gaps where like you can move. Like in the Morse code. Like in writing, what is writing? It's just usually a bit of black and white. And this is why I chose the black and white, because for me it's linked with writing, with ink, with paper, with surface, with traces, which is the main thing, I think, for a lot of us.
All these images look like scores to me. I mean, that everyone was showing, and Siobhán, some of Siobhán's drawings I have used as scores in the past, but your photography as well, and so many of the photos of the dry stone walls and the walls along a path, and I just see those and I just hear it. I just want to use it as a structure.
So, because it kind of comes to you in different forms, really, doesn't it? That's what I think that's what you mean. That you, when you look at it, you can, I don't know, somehow feel, extrapolate out of it music and forms and mathematics. And
but it is kind of fundamentally music of place, music of material, not my music, because I'm expressing me, the meanness of me. And Tim wasn't interested in any of that either. So.
Siobhán, I mean, some of this strikes a chord as well, pardon the pun, but with your own work as well in terms of the markings. And we had a session down as well, we were going to talk about landmarks and language. So, I mean, these are different ways in terms of the seismography that you were looking at in your work and putting the work through the materiality of it as well, too.
Yes. Well, marks are so important to me because it's what I, it's what I do. And for me, I kind of do a bit of what Susan does, and I separate myself, but then a lot of the time it's very much about shutting the mind down completely, and takes a long time, and then just getting into a space where I can make a mark, and that can be sometimes, it can take weeks. If I'm getting ready for an exhibition and I'm working on some canvases or something, and it just takes a long time get the ego and all of that out of the way and empty the head, and then just, very often I'll put a mark down and I have to take it away again, but it's the stain that it's left means more to me than the mark itself. The, sort of like it's the way geology is formed, I guess. It's, the rocks are there, then part of it goes and then it leaves a trace. So I kind of make work, and I intuitively just follow that process. But that piece that's partially painting, partially drawing, and partially mushroom. I grew the mushrooms, it's a long story, but I made it on the bog sites, and it attached itself to the drawing, and then I finished off the pieces.
Nice.
Truly organic.
We might make a bit of space for time from the audience as well, if anybody have any questions or observations for any of the speakers. They're worn out. Moya.
Absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you for such an absolutely fascinating conversation. Certainly the roundwood conversations live. But I'm interested, you talked about this material, Siobhán, that you're making called solar skin.
Yeah.
What's it made of?
Is this the white piece?
Yeah.
It's the physical form, the material, the surface was sea sponge, because that was all about my trip in the Arctic when I was watching the ice calving and splitting apart, because I was moving across on a boat. But I was also working with the European Space Agency, and they were creating the surface for the front of the Solar Orbiter spacecraft, which is the front of the spacecraft was going right up to the nose of the sun, well, as far as it could. It was going to a place we've never been to before in the sun, and it was going to photograph. Oh, it's a long story. Anyway, the material that they invented while I was working with them for 2 years, and they were doing these experiments all the time, and I was in the other room using the material that they were discarding. They invented this particular material with carbon and charred bone, which is ironic because carbon is the thing that's, screwing up the atmosphere in ways, but also it has this material property that's extraordinary because it's very, very heat resistant. And charred bone also harks of cave paintings, which I loved. So it was these dualities going back and forward in time, because the spacecraft was going to the future, yet it was carrying the materials from Stone Age, And so we had bags and bags of charred bone that was literally black powder. And when they put it through the process, we got solar white and solar black. And solar black did one side and solar white did the front. So this piece was about the process of the heat as the glaciers melt, the relationship to the sun. The piece at the back is an artwork made out of skin. And it kind of represents the sun in a way, and it's also a map of an animal, because when you see it up close, the veins of the animal denotes the journey of its life. Anyway, so the material of that, yes, to answer you, is charred bone and carbon.
I think we have time for one more question. Jane, I think, yeah.
Okay, just I'd like to ask Nicolas a question, because I think, Nicolas, you had the unusual privilege of working over a period of time with Tim, and I imagine there's a sort of exchange there. And I just wondered, you know, unlike the rest of us who very often just receive impressions and sort of modify our way of thinking thanks to the work, I was just wondering, in that process, did you find that your own practice as a photographer was changing? Or did it have any impact on you personally? Did your exchanges, for example, lead you to see things differently? Because you started, I think, with a really good knowledge of Tim's work, and then working side by side was there. And I could see you looking frantically through your notes.
Yeah.
So maybe it was the wrong question to ask difficult questions at the end of the session.
Yes, I haven't thought about it, I have to say. I think it's only starting now to realize the impact he has. Oh, yeah, he still has, yeah. On what any of us can do. On a practical level, when we met, we didn't talk too much. We were more. It was more kind of a dialogue through ideas, exchange of ideas. So, for example, a gap would be an idea we would be talking about, but not directly to what he did and the influence on what I do, or the opposite, or no, there were many gaps. So I can say, sorry.
It's one we can take over a gap of a cup of tea, maybe. One final question, yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely, John.
It's just something that's on my mind, and like Moya, I mean, your conversation was so interesting, I thought I should ask you about the relationship between the maps and the writing. Because I mean, Tim once, I was challenging him once about the maps, and he said, well, I'm not a cartographer, I have no interest in cartography. Like, he has no interest in the maps. And he was saying the maps are just, they're just me accounting for myself. Because what he's really interested in is the things he's discovering as he's exploring, which will feed his writing. But then you can't imagine his writing without the maps. But you're not looking at the maps as mappery, if you know what I mean. So I wonder what you think about his work. He came into his work through language. I mean, once you write a narrative, but his mind is a kind of conceptual artist's mind, or a mathematician's mind, or something. So I maybe it doesn't matter, but I'm trying to separate out what I think is the legacy, you know, and is the legacy the writing, is the legacy the map, or does it matter to?
You can't separate them, I think. You can't really separate them.
Yeah, I think
so,
there
yeah,
is.
I don't think he himself didn't think of himself as a map maker.
No,
I don't think he would. Yeah.
No, for him, he was an artist.
Yeah.
That's
It was a way of
in different
documenting and
Siobhán,
Yeah, it's just a different move, I think. For example, there is some kind of a pattern, but he's always the same. He's an artist. And at the beginning, the visual artist, you could say, what is he doing? He's doing these very geometrical paintings. Often it looks like a lens, by the way. And what he does, he goes out. So from the studio, he goes out. He puts the painting outside, in galleries, outside in the street, let the people play with them, see what's happening. And then I think later on in his life, after his move to Aaron, it's the opposite. It's the outside coming into the studio. And what I think interesting with the map, the map is another move, because the map invites you to go out. And there is always gone to and fro, forth and back with team like this.
That's
between
a part of his work as an artist, really.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, then he blew up the maps in big size and put them on the floor and had people walk on them. So it's another dimension of that.
I was going to say, it occurred to me that maybe for Tim as well, it was the act of making the mark after being physically engaged with the landscape, you know, and coming in off those huge walks and disappearing for days. Maybe it was the act of not only just the writing that he would do afterwards, the notations at night that you mentioned, but the act of actually paring the pencil and physically putting his mark in scaled down form, and the way the kind of gesture that he made on the page may have helped him to process his writing. I don't know.
I think you're right about that.
You know what I mean? It's the physicality of that. And then he was thinking about, he often talked to me about geometry, you know, about geometries. And then we were talking about the geometry of our dreams. So there's these senses of like these different scales of like being physical in the world, and then your dream time in your spirit world. There's another geometry, you know? So maybe this was his scaling down of his physical foot. It helped him to process it. I don't know.
It's another way of balancing what he talked about is the territory between aesthetics and logic.
Yeah.
That,
yeah.
you know,
yeah.
the glory of the landscape, and then kind of addressing it in this other way.
Yeah, and needing to put it down.
Yeah.
But something that also struck me just when you were asking that question is, I know we have to finish now in a sec, was that the maps, I was saying at the start, you know, that the maps as maps are functional and work, but for me, my approach to them was always as something else beyond that. But sure, everyone can see that. I'm not unique in that, right? But I saw this thing just before we started talking here today. I think I was just looking over on the wall over there, but Tim Robinson mentioning part of when he was mapping the Burren, you know, and he came upon this field, and there wasn't a name for it. But
a strange field.
I mean, come on, he calls it a strange field. I mean, isn't that just fantastic, right? So I was just thinking there when you asked that question and people were answering here that another way for me of interpreting the maps is that he created mysteries within the maps as well for us to maybe decode or maybe not decode at all, but accept them as mysteries. And that as much as he was naming places, he was also giving us kind of permission to enter into this other kind of space of mystery and adventure in some way. I thought they were very playful. They're very playful maps, you know. So that kind of feeds into his creative endeavours in terms of being a visual artist and a writer as well. It's all of one, really, isn't it? Yeah.
I just want to say thanks so much to the panellists. It's been a fantastic session. We could be here until tomorrow.